Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Chana. Thank you for everybody at the OU. I'd like to share an article that was written by Mark Twain. Many of you probably have heard this article, but it's still worth hearing again. Okay, so the title is, this wonderful article was written in 1899 when anti-Semitism was widespread in the US. Large companies did not hire Jewish people. People like Ford and Edison expressed their feelings openly. So the following was written by Mark Twain in Harper's in September of 1899. Allow me to read this. I'm sure many of you have heard this before, worth hearing again and again. Quote, if the statistics are right, the Jews constitute but 1% of the human race. It suggests a nebulous dim puff of stardust lost in the blaze of the Milky Way. Properly, the Jew ought hardly to be heard of, but he is heard of, has always been heard of. He is as prominent on the planet as any other people, and his commercial importance is extravagantly out of proportion to the smallness of his bulk. His contributions to the world's list of great names in literature, science, art, music, finance, medicine, and abstruse learning are always out of proportion to the weakness of his members or numbers. He has made a marvelous fight in the world in all the ages and has done it with his hands tied behind him. He could be vain of himself and he could be excused for it. The Egyptian, the Babylonian, and the Persian rose, filled the planet with sound and splendor, then faded to dream stuff and passed away. The Greek and the Roman followed and made a vast noise, and they are gone. Other peoples have sprung up and held their torch high for a time, but it has burned out, and they sit in twilight now or have vanished. The Jews saw them all, beat them all, and is now what he always was, exhibiting no decadence, no infirmities of age, no weakening of his parts, no slowing of his energies, no dulling of his alert and aggressive mind. All things are mortal but the Jew. All other forces pass, but he remains. What is the secret of his immortality? Okay. The key line, right? This powerful line, all things are mortal but the Jew. The Zohar teaches us a beautiful concept. Kudsha Barichu, God, V'oraisa, V'Yisrael Chadu, the Jewish people and the Torah and God, they're all intertwined. They all express a certain singleness. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. All things are mortal but the Jew, because the Jewish people carry the torch of Hashem. The Torah is the secret to our immortality. One of the things that we have to remember in this dark time is that the Iranians will fade, just as the other nations have faded. Hamas will disappear. There will come a day where there will be no Hamas, but the Jewish people will always remain. And the idea is that we have to stay strong, and we have to let nothing defeat us. We have to allow nothing to weaken our resolve and to give up hope. The beautiful idea from the Likutei Moharan, Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, which is a beautiful idea, whether Breslov Torah appeals to you or not. Haklal, says Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, Ki asur liyash atzmai, one must never give up. Even if you're a simple person who cannot learn, or in your place where a person cannot learn, there are situations in life where a person is unable to learn, where the darkness becomes so intense that it seems that nothing could encourage the person. Even in a dark and time of pure simplicity, every person has to strengthen himself according to his reality as he exists in any given moment. Because the source of life that we draw from is always the Torah. Even the greatest tzaddik, people that are great minds, people like Rav Soloveitchik, people like the Rebbe of Lubavitch, great Torah figures, at times they had to resort to simpleness, right? The simple idea where a person is not able to learn, a person is not able to strengthen himself or encourage himself, but even in those times, a person has to sometimes resort to a certain simplicity and just recognize that Hashem is the life force, Hashem is holding us, Hashem is guaranteeing our continuity. Even if somebody finds himself in the lowest level, spiritually, physically, emotionally, he can also come back and return. He can also receive life from the Torah. The main thing is to strengthen yourself in whatever way, shape, or form you can. And then comes the famous line that everybody's familiar with, there's no despair in the world whatsoever, meaning to say that there is never a situation where a person should despair. There's never a reason to despair. And he said in Yiddish, Ken Yush is garnet farhenden. Okay? And he really drew out those words and he says, Kain Yush, there's no despair in the world of Amr B'Kach Gadol. He said with strength and with conviction. That was the idea, that was the beautiful idea that Rabbi Nachman Breslov would emphasize again and again, and it's true that a person should never despair. The Jewish people in the aftermath of the Holocaust picked themselves up and built what we see today in Eretz Yisrael, which is one of the greatest miracles in the history of mankind. The Yaivitz, Rabbi Yaakov Emden, wrote that the greatest miracle of history is the survival of the Jewish people. Some people overlook it, but this is not something that Mark Twain overlooked. And Mark Twain came to the truth that all things are mortal but the Jew. And one of the keys to our immortality is the fact that we'll never lose hope. Okay? That no matter what happens to us, no matter what we experience on an individual level, what we experience on a national and communal level, we will never give hope. Okay? And Rabbi Nachman Breslov taught us the idea, even if a person finds himself in a lowly place spiritually, there is still no reason whatsoever to give up hope. So that's the idea. That's the key to our immortality. And we draw that power, that belief that we should never give up and there always is hope. That's something that we draw from the Torah. Because the Torah repeatedly confirms and reaffirms the promise that Hashem made to his nation that we will be forever, that we will never pass, that we will always continue to exist, as the pasuk in Parshat B'chukot says, "Va'af gam zot biotem be'eretz oiveim," even when we are in the lands of our enemies, right? I will not reject you, right? I will keep you close. So therefore, being part of the Jewish people, right, guarantees an eternal existence. Not only something that's eternal, but also the infinite, because the Jewish people are one with Hashem, one with the Torah. Hashem is eternal, the Torah is eternal, and that's the source of our hope. And that's what we should turn to, and that's what we should hold on to, no matter what happens. I mentioned the other week, I told some of the story of my grandfather as he came out of Auschwitz. Forgive me if I can maybe repeat some of the details of the story, and I'd like to dwell on some of the points here. As I mentioned 2 weeks ago, my grandfather was deported from Nitra Yeshiva in the summer of 1944. And he came out of Auschwitz, he came out of Buchenwald, he did the death march from Auschwitz to Buchenwald. As I mentioned 2 weeks ago, there was a Jew from Holland, And the Jew from Holland spoke up when one of the American generals was touring Buchenwald, and he said to him, he says, don't just walk around here and look at us, do something. And my grandfather was put on an intravenous. He was weaned back to life. He came back to Bratislava in Slovakia. He married my grandmother. My grandmother also already collapsed on the death march and was picked up by her sister as a Nazi was approaching in order to shoot my grandmother. And they built a family, and now they have over 1,000 descendants. The Klozim Begrevis said that the greatest miracle of the Holocaust is that we didn't give up, that we were able to come out of the camps and rebuild. According to the natural law, we should have been completely broken, yet somehow Hashem gave us the power and the courage to rebuild, and boy, did we rebuild something beyond and above anything imaginable. Nobody would have foreseen what we rebuild, and that's part of the immortality of the Jewish people. And when my grandfather went back to the Nitra yeshiva, he wanted to find the Sfarim that were written by his brothers. He had two brothers, an older brother and a younger brother that did not survive. My grandfather was the sole survivor in his family, did not have any surviving siblings or parents. And he knew that his older and younger brother wrote a number of books on the Talmud. They were young boys. My grandfather's younger brother Pinchas perished at the age of 16, and his older brother Nissen perished at the age of 19. And they were brilliant Torah scholars that had written books on the Talmud, and he wanted to find what his brothers had written. And everything was destroyed. But he managed to uncover a small notebook, and that notebook was written on the topic of Tanai Kafel. Tanai Kafel is a Talmudic section that appears in the Tractate of Kiddushin and in other places that describes the legalities of a Tanai, of a condition. It has to be expressed. There has to be a specific construct in order for the condition to be legally binding in halacha. And he wrote a small kuntris, a small notebook on this topic. He wrote at the age of 16. And my grandfather looked at the date, and it was dated in July of 1944, which was 3 weeks before my grandfather and brothers were deported to Auschwitz. My grandfather said that in July of 1944, most of Europe had already been destroyed. There were almost no existing Jewish communities in mainland Europe. Nitra was the last enclave that was still carrying on. There was a yeshiva there. And because the Rosh Yeshiva, whose name was the author of the Min HaMeitzar, Rabbi Weissmandl had bribed the Germans and managed to delay the deportation of the yeshiva in the community in Nitra. So they were the last ones to be deported from Auschwitz. In fact, my grandfather's brother was still writing Chidush Torah, even though their father had already been deported and probably murdered by then in the gas chambers. Yet this 16-year-old boy was writing Chidush Torah, was writing Torah novella, and this booklet is what survived from the Holocaust. This is the only Torah writing that survived from everything that he wrote in the years of his yeshiva learning. My grandfather was approached by the Yad Vashem Museum that had offered to buy this booklet. My grandfather wished to keep the booklet in the family, and he printed it. And this, right, is an illustration of how the Torah gives us the strength, it gives us the inspiration and the fortitude to carry on and not to give up and not to throw in the towel in the most difficult times. It's recorded but that the Bali Tosfot, those that wrote the Tosfot, right, even hours before they were murdered by the Crusades, they were still writing Torah novella. We have a Perush, we have a commentary on Seder Taharot, the most difficult of the 6 orders of the Mishnah. Taharot, the laws of spiritual purity and impurity, was written by the Marami Rudenberg, the great Rabbi Meir of Rudenberg, who was the leading sage in Germany approximately 800 years ago. And the parish that we have It's recorded by his students, by the Tashbeit, that was a commentary on the Mishnah that was written when the Maran Württemberg was sitting in prison, when he was put in jail, right? The government had taken the Maran Württemberg hostage. The Jewish community was ready to redeem him, was ready to buy him out of captivity, but the Maran Württemberg gave the order that under no circumstances should he be redeemed out of captivity, because there is a halacha that appears in Mesechet Kedushin that ein podin shvuin yoter mikdei demeim, which means that we don't redeem captives, people that are taken hostage, for more than their value. And the reason is because otherwise the enemies of the Jewish people will be incentivized to kidnap more people. So therefore the halacha tells us that we don't redeem captives, which is unfortunately a very hard lesson that we learned, that when we teach our enemies that they could kidnap Jewish people, that they could get thousands of terrorists we learned the lesson the hard way, that sometimes it does not pay, because returning 1,000 terrorists for one person could incentivize them to do the same. So the halacha teaches us that we don't redeem captives for more than their value. So the Maram Württemberg's orders were not to redeem him out of prison, but he still had a Talmud, the Tashbe, who wrote a work called the Tashbeitz, who came to the prison to learn from his Rebbe. And it was in those circumstances that the Maran Württemberg was able to write an entire commentary on the Seder of the Order of Taharot. And time in and time again, the Jewish people have held strong to the Torah, and this has given them the inspiration and the fortitude to survive in the most trying times, in the darkest times. And as Rabbi Menachem Ibreslov taught us, that even if somebody doesn't know how to learn, even if somebody does not know how to learn Torah, he says, even an Ish Pashut, if he holds on to the belief that he's part of an eternal nation, that he's a nation that was chosen by God, that is the torchbearer of godliness and kindness and compassion in the world, and that would give him strength not to despair, that's also a way of connecting to the Torah. So whether you know how to learn or whether you don't know how to learn, every single Jewish person has a chelik in the Torah. We say in the davening of Shabbos and in the prayers of the Shalosh Regalim, we say, V'tein chalkeinu b'Toratecha, we beseech Hashem that He should give us our portion in the Torah. A person should pray that even if he does not know how to learn Torah, right? When the rabbis composed the reading of the Shemona Esrei, it was written for every Jew. It was written for the simple Jew and was written for the sophisticated Jew. And as Rabbi Nachman Breslov taught us in that piece, that sometimes even the most sophisticated Jew, the most brilliant mind, sometimes has to resort to simplicity and strengthen the basic belief and this basic inspiration that we belong to an eternal nation, a nation that touches upon the infinite, a godly nation, and to draw strength, to never despair no matter what happens. So this is what survived. We mentioned there's a Medrash, Sikta Rabbah, that tells us the Torah shalamaditi ba'af is kamibi, the Torah that's learned in the most trying and difficult times, that's what stood by me. There's a certain specialness, a certain eternal element to Torah that's learned in the most difficult times. It's immeasurably more valuable if a person learns in difficult times, when a person is in the darkness, to learn Torah in those difficult times that has immeasurable value. There's something special about that Torah learning. And it was in the case of my grandfather's brother, that was the Torah that stood with him, that was the Torah that survived, that was the notebook that's still alive today, written by this 16-year-old boy, whilst his father had been murdered, whilst all the communities in Europe had been destroyed. There was still a boy sitting in mainland Europe, in Slovakia, in Nitra, writing Torah novella. So that should be a source of inspiration for us all. Okay? We learn in this week's Parshas told us about the competition between Yaakov and Esav. Okay? The Torah tells us, the Medrash tells us, that Rivka was unaware that she had twins. Rashi, quoting the Medrash, tells us that when Rivka in her pregnancy would pass by the house of idol worship, she felt a commotion. She felt that the fetus inside of her was trying to get out. So that concerned her. She thought that the baby inside of her had a tendency to idol worship. Then when she passed by the house of Torah learning, the academy of shame, where they studied godliness, she felt that the baby was trying to get out, and that concerned her. And as we all know, she came to shame and she received the message that she had two babies inside of her. That there's going to be this constant competition, and she was told that when Jacob rises, Esav will fall, and when Esav rises, Yaakov will fall. And there's a famous question: where was the Bechira? It seems that Esav was almost predestined to become wicked, right? Isn't there a Bechira? The Rambam famously says in Hilchos Tshuva that every single Jew, every single person could be as great as Moshe Rabbeinu, and every single person could be as evil as Yeravam ben Nevat, the evil king of Yisrael that led the entire Jewish people on a path of idol worship. So the question is, where was the Bechira? Where was the free will? It seems that Esav already, from inside of his mother's womb, was already predisposed to idol worship. So I encourage everybody to look at a beautiful piece from Rabbi Gedalia Shur. Rabbi Gedalia Shur was an American-born Gadol Batorah. He was the Rosh Hashiva of Torah V'das. And based on the Rizal, he has a beautiful essay where he goes about to explain this idea. There is the Bechina, according to the Rizal, of Sur Meira, where a person has a job in this world to subdue evil, to subdue the evil inclinations, the natural tendencies that lead the person on a path of lust and arrogance and other bad characteristics. And then there's the Asay Tov, there's the job to increase goodness in the world. Explains the Arizal that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had intended that Cain and Hevel each take these two respective roles. That Hevel, who had a more good inclination, right, he would increase good in the world, and Cain, who had a more evil inclination, would subdue the evil, and that's how he would create godliness in the world. And Cain felt very discouraged, and Hashem says to Cain, there's no reason to be discouraged, even if a person was born with a certain evil inclination, the petach chatas roivates, even though you have the sin waiting there, crouching in there to cause a person to sin. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu promises Cain that if you're determined enough, you can subdue the evil inclination inside of you. So there were supposed to be 4 avot, according to the Medrash. According to the Arizal, there were actually supposed to be four fathers, even though we have 3, but there was actually supposed to be 4. And Asa was supposed to be the 4th of the 4 fathers. There's a Medrash that says that David HaMelech became the Regel Harvila Merkava. Kodesh Baruch Hu has a chariot. It's obviously metaphoric, but Hashem has a chariot. And David HaMelech became the 4th leg of there was a 3-leg chariot of Hashem, and then David HaMelech was supposed to be the 4th one, the 4th leg of the Merkava. There's something common about David HaMelech and Esav. As we know, as we read in this week's parsha, that Esav was born Admoni, completely red. Right? Red is symbolic of a bad nature, of murder, of a tendency to do things that are wrong. It's the blood inside of us, metaphorically and in a certain sense physiologically too, that make us do things that we shouldn't be doing. So it's the red, right? Esav was born Admoni, full of red, and Esav was supposed to personify that power to subdue all evil. Who else was born red? David HaMelech. David HaMelech was also born Kule Adomi. So the Adomi, the red nature, is the common feature that appears both with David and both with Esav. Explains Rabbi Gedalia Shur based on the Arizal that Yaakov was supposed to be the Bechina of Asay Tov. Yaakov Avinu was born with a very good nature, and he was supposed to devote his life to godliness and increasing goodness in the world. And Esav was supposed to go out into the world and subdue evil. What happened is that Esav failed in his mission. He didn't do what he was charged to do, and that's why Yaakov had to take the mission of Esav. Initially, Yaakov was supposed to be engaged only in the Bechina, only in the aspect of the Asay Tov, of increasing goodness in the world. And because Esav had failed his mission, so therefore Yaakov had to take on Esav's mission. That's expressed in the fact that Yaakov Avinu took the Zivug, he took the designated wife of Esav, which was Leah. Okay, because Leah was supposed to be the partner of Esav in order to complete the mission of Sur Meirah, of defeating evil in the world. And because Esav didn't do that, right? So Yaakov took Esav's partner, designated partner, because since he took over the mission of Esav, he also had to take the designated partner of Esav. That is what the Rizal teaches us. And what happened is that the child that was born from Rachel was Yosef. Yosef was born with a very good inclination. The primary child that came from Leah was Judah. Right? Judah represented the kingship. His descendant David HaMelech became the king of Judah. And therefore Yehuda continued the mission that Esav was supposed to complete. Later it was manifested in David HaMelech. And Yosef, right, Rashi says that Yosef was the perfect match of Yaakov. Rashi says that everything that Yaakov Avinu's son Rachel, he saw that in Yosef. Yosef was the perfect tzaddik. And the Gemara in Sanhedrin points out that David HaMelech had made major failures. He sent Uriah HaChitti to the front lines and unjustly caused his death. David HaMelech took Bathsheba, which was a very severe violation of the will of Hashem. The Gemara does teach us that David HaMelech was saved by a technicality, that she wasn't technically an Eshet Ish, because before going off to war, the soldiers used to give divorces to their wives, so that if they were missing in action, their wives would not be in aguna, their wives would not be trapped and unable to marry. But nevertheless, she was still designated to Uriah. There was an understanding that when Uriah would come back from battle, he would take Bathsheba. So there obviously was something problematic in David HaMelech taking Bathsheba, yet the Gemara says Hashem forgave David HaMelech. Shaul, by contrast, had done something which one would consider much less problematic. Right? Shmuel HaNavi had told Shaul HaMelech to please wait till he arrives before bringing the karbanot. He didn't wait. And then Hashem already says you're going to lose the kingship. That's it. You're finished. And the question is how come David HaMelech, who had done something which one would expect to be so much more severe, he was forgiven, and yet Shaul HaMelech, who had done something so much less serious, had the monarchy taken away from him? You find the same question also by Yosef and by Yehuda. The Medrash tells us, and it's quoted by Rashi, that when Yosef HaTzadik had this test with the wife Potiphar, an image of his father appeared before him, and he was told that if he sins with the wife of Potiphar, he's going to have his name removed from the choshet, from the breastplate of the high priest, which means to say he's going to be rejected as one of the 12 tribes. That means to say that Yosef was told that he would not be given a second chance. Yet, we find by contrast that Yehuda had met a prostitute on the fork of the road. He didn't know that it was his daughter-in-law Tamar, but he had done which one would consider a much more serious Aveira, right? He had taken a woman, he had lived with a woman that was there at the fork of the road, an act of engaging in relations with a prostitute, and yet Yehuda was forgiven. So we see that there was much more leeway given to Yehuda, right, who was the forefather, who was the forebearer of David HaMelech, and yet Yosef, who was the forebearer of Shaul HaMelech, just like his descendant Shaul, was given very little leeway. He was told that he was told that if he messed up, he would be given no second chance. So there's a beautiful Gaon of Vilna, Rav Eliyahu, Elijah of Vilna. He has a commentary on the Tikkunei Zohar, and he's quoted also in his work, or this work of his student, the Even Shleim, which is a collection of teachings from the Gaon of Vilna. And he says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Marach Af, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives much more leeway and has much more patience for somebody who is the Bechina of a Baal Tshuva, the Bechina of somebody who comes from the side of Sur Meirah. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives him leeway. If a person has a bad inclination, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives him leeway. He lets him time and again get up again and try again and fix his ways. But somebody who comes from the Bechina of Yosef HaTzadik or Shaul HaMelech, the Gemara tells us, the Gemara interprets, for Shaul, the Mavi describes how Shaul was a Ben Yoimai, which the Gemara interprets to mean he was a Tinnik Ben Yoimai, which means to say he was born, he was clean of sin. He was not, even in his advanced age, he had not sinned in any way, shape, or form. HaKadosh Baruch Hu holds that person to a much higher responsibility. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives less leeway to the person. So he says, so therefore, Esav, even though he was born with a very bad inclination, but if he would have fulfilled his mission, right, instead of David being the fourth regel, the fourth foot of the Merkava, it would have been Esav. HaKadosh Baruch Hu would have forgiven him. But the problem of Esav is that he gave up. He was miyayish. In his spiritual journey, he wasn't determined to go through it until the end. And that's why he lost his mission. He didn't fulfill the mission that he was charged to do. And therefore, David HaMelech, with all of his ups and all of his downs, David HaMelech managed to stick to his mission. He didn't lose his focus. He did what he was charged to do. And therefore, in the end, David HaMelech, who was Admoni, who was red, who had a bad inclination, he was able to achieve what no other man had done. And if you look at the life of David HaMelech had experienced every single hardship that a person could ever experience. He had lost children. He had sons that rebelled against him, Adoniah and Avshalom. Every imaginable hardship that a person could experience, David HaMelech had experienced it. And in fact, the Gemara says that David HaMelech should have not fallen with Bathsheba. The Torah teaches us that when a person subdues his Yetzer Hara and he works hard enough, HaKadosh Baruch Hu provides a certain protection that he should not fall to his Yetzer Hara. As we had learned recently in the Daf Yomi, in the end of Kedushin, that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Meir, both the greatest Torah scholars of Israel, they had almost fallen to the Yetzer Hara, but Hashem said, because of their great stature, HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, when you work hard enough to make sure that you don't fall to the Yetzer Hara, you are granted a certain divine protection. So the question is, how come David wasn't granted that protection? So the Gemara says that David had given all of his heart and soul to subdue his evil inclination. He should have received a certain protection. HaKadosh Baruch Hu should have prevented him from falling with Bathsheba. But the Gemara says that Hashem let it happen so that he could be an opening, that he could open the path for the Balei Tshuva, for those that fall in sin. Which means to say, David HaMelech, as the king of Israel, needed to teach every single individual how to contend with his Yetzer Hara. He had to be the guiding light for people to struggle with children that rebel. He had to be the guiding light to help people contend with losing children. He had to be the person to teach people how to contend with poverty, how to contend with being a fugitive. Every single challenge that he experienced was so that he could be a guiding light and he could teach future Jews how to overcome the challenges of life. So therefore, if David HaMelech, the king of Israel, was going to teach the future generations how to get up after having fallen to sin, how to contend and how to deal with situations where people experience spiritual downfalls, David HaMelech had to go through that experience himself so that he could teach others how to do that. And that's why we find that the line of monarchy that comes from Shaul HaMelech, that comes from Yosef, that line of monarchy didn't survive. The 10 lost tribes are lost. But the line of monarchy that survives, the line that comes from David HaMelech. It's the line that comes from the people that have the natural evil inclination, but learn to never give up and learn to overcome. And that's what continues to survive today. Just as Hashem told Yosef that if he messed up, he wouldn't be given another chance. Shaul HaMelech messed up on something on something that somebody would consider something minor, but he wasn't given another chance. But the Judah, who had fallen with the prostitute at the fork of the road, the David HaMelech, who had fallen repeatedly again and again, but was determined to get up, they represent the eternal of Israel. They continue to survive, they continue to thrive, and that's the story of the Jewish people, that throughout the downfalls and despite everything that happens, the Jewish people have learned to get up and to never give up hope. So this is what we need to remind ourselves in this time, right? We're facing great enemies, we're facing Hamas, we're facing Iran, and all sorts of other enemies. But they're going to fall. They're not going to exist. There's going to come a time that they're going to fall just as the Babylonians had fallen, just as the Persians had fallen, and just as all the other nations, the great nations, had risen and fallen. That's what's going to happen. We, the Jewish people, never give up hope. Okay, no matter what happens, right? Even if we're not in a good place physically, nationally, emotionally, whatever situation we're in, we are guaranteed. And the individuals that will survive and will be part of this eternity are the people that are determined to never give up. Okay, so with that, I would like to end the shir, and I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. And may we see the light very, very soon, and with a prayer for our soldiers that Hashem should protect them, Hashem should grant them victory, and that the hostages, Hashem, please have them return soon, that they'll be able to come back to their families, and that all the Jewish people should have the protection and the inspiration, and whatever anybody's going through, we should have salvation speedily in our days. Thank you for joining us.